So now, having already talked about Village when it comes to the Tzeentch side of things, I want to go into a discussion today about Slaanesh. And with Slaanesh, I want to go into Azazel. So I've already said this in the Village video, but I am going to be making a Warriors of Chaos DLC speculation video in which I will go through all 4 of the respective Chaos gods and who I think Creative Assembly would choose to represent them. Now, this wouldn't say that maybe all 4 are coming in a DLC. It would be saying that, hey, if they decided to do a Warriors of Chaos update that might possibly include Norska, because they've already said we're getting a Norska Old World update, quote unquote Old World update, who would possibly lead that faction? And a lot of the arguments that people have been making is, Valkia, for example, is not a demon prince, or I'm sorry, it is a demon. Well, if we look at the 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy rules, we see that she actually is not a demon. She doesn't have the demon keyword. She is, for all intents and purposes, from a rules standpoint, 8th edition, not a demon. But we look at the lore of her, she's clearly ascended to demonhood by Khorne. So what I think that if Creative Assembly were to do a Warriors of Chaos, and I'm talking about the faction Warriors of Chaos, DLC, they would have some sort of demonic character leading a Warriors of Chaos Mortal DLC pack thing. It's kind of confusing now that the way I've structured that, but a lot of people think about Sigvald when we think about Slaanesh, and I think that that's fair because Sigvald's in the game. But Sigvald, for all intents and purposes, is pretty much just mortal. Azazel, on the other hand, is very clearly a demon prince, and he has a very interesting lore that extends beyond the earlier editions that he was present in. So we're going to go through the early edition lore. We're going to talk about his rule set at the very end, of course, but then we're also going to jump into some of the, well, a lot of the information that we get from the Time of Legends books. Now, the Time of Legends books came out and they pretty much jump into a lot of the pivotal characters of the backdrop of Warhammer Fantasy. For this video, we'll be talking about Sigmar Heldenhammer, who is, of course, the backdrop for the entirety of the Old World and the Empire, right? But they've also done ones for Malekith, they've done them for Nagash, they've done them for Neferata. So all those big name characters that have filled up, oh, this is what the vampire counts are about, this is what Khemri is all about, this is what the Dark Elves are all about. They even did one for Anarian. So they've done these to kind of fill the gaps between editions and what these characters are. So this is where we get a lot of this big juicy information. So we're going to read here today a lot about Azazel and maybe even a little debut, a little taste of some Everchosen action in here as we peter off in the end of Azazel's lore. So that's how we'll structure this video here today, going through the early edition lore of Azazel, jumping into that Time of Legends action before kind of rounding out the video talking about some speculation on how he would be brought into the game from a rules standpoint, looking at his special rules. So let's jump on here into some fun speculation for Azazel, the captain of the Ecstatic Legion. Now, in my typical fashion of doing things, we're going to read this excerpt from the Citadel Journal of Azazel from 6th edition. Now, Azazel came around in the 5th edition as part of a separate supplement to the Chaos faction. It was called Champions of Chaos, and it was, back in the day, you had all these books that would say, hey, here was the rule for the entire army set, but then they would sometimes release just a book of special characters for specific armies and factions and whatnot. So they had a bunch of different wild rules in 5th edition that they kind of standardized and put into a very streamlined process for 6th edition that kind of carried on until the end of Warhammer Fantasy through to the 8th edition, and what is kind of now the blueprint for even the way 40k and End Times and Age of Sigmar now is structured. But here's this little bit here for Azazel, Prince of Damnation, and it's pretty interesting because it's a very, it kind of, this story will morph as we talk about what happens in the Heldenhammer books. So when Azazel abandoned humanity and pledged his mortal soul to the service of Slaanesh, none can say, but it is rumored that in the distant past he was the leader of the Garian tribe, one of the 12 great peoples that followed Sigmar, the first emperor. Legend says that he betrayed his liege lord and escaped to the northern wastes, pledging loyalty to Slaanesh, the young prince of chaos. Azazel was greatly favored by his master and rose quickly in his esteem. After slaying Arthar, the exalted champion of Khorne in single combat, Slaanesh turned his eyes upon Azazel and elevated him to demonhood, making him commander of the Prince of Chaos's demonic legions. It is said that the beauty of Azazel is second only to his patron, But as irresistible as his beauty is, there is a deadly edge to it. Those who have gazed upon him never forget the sensual temptation his presence arouses. It is a beauty which evokes loathing and a temptation that sickens the soul. Azazel's hair is long, jet black, and as fine as flax. 2 great lacquered horns crown his handsome brow. His eyes are full of innocence, yet they are cruel, calculating, and without pity. His smooth skin is white, the color of the finest porcelain, and his movements are graceful, his limbs long and delicate. In his right hand he carries an enchanted blade that writhes as if alive, and his left hand is a long chitinous claw, delicate and yet deadly. His wings are of the purest white, their beauty unmatched by swans or other creations of nature. He soars over the battlefield, sometimes sweeping low to strike his foes, and yet his feet never touch the ground. Azazel dresses in robes made of the finest silks, and his body is bedecked with gorgeous jewels and shining gems. Azazel commands a legion of demon princes, or demons of his master, and under his command the armies of the Prince of Chaos have enjoyed one blissful triumph after another. Most of their opponents give up the fight before it even begins, for few can bring themselves to harm such an enchanting and wondrous being as Azazel. Azazel, on the other hand, has no such qualms. So you get a very Slaanesh depiction of this character, as you would imagine, because it's Slaanesh. And we get a lore for a character, too, that has changed a lot over the years. And it's very interesting as far as demon princes go. There's a lot of character behind Azazel. Most of the demon princes are just kind of this very one note, very like, yes, I am chaos, fall before me, I am corrupted. And it is very kind of, well, tropey, to be totally honest. You read any of the lore for a lot of these demon princes, which are more often than not secondary or even tertiary characters in a lot of that kind of wide-spanning lore for chaos. Unless they are a very prominent one, like I said, they're just kind of treated as a foil to whoever the protagonist is. But Azazel has a very interesting bit of lore and a very interesting history as it kind of spans throughout the continuation in the Heldenhammer novels. So one of the biggest differences, and I'm going to go through how those Heldenhammer novels kind of make their way through everything. But one of the biggest differences is that his name itself is Garion. He's not from the tribe Garion. That's his name. So it's just kind of interesting that you get the morsels, the initial scraps of what becomes the expanded lore. And it's why dealing with the lore for Warhammer is oftentimes like trying to pick out like a very specific strand of spaghetti through a whole bowl of spaghetti where like everything's interlinked, but some of the stuff doesn't make much sense. Oh, okay, now I see where that connects, and so on and so forth. And Azazel's character, I think, for Total War Warhammer would be a lot of fun because we have this very big direct connection to the Empire. You get a lot of motivation as we jump into the lore we're about to get into as to how he kind of comes about, and then his genesis, and eventually what it leads to as far as a prolonged assault upon the empire. Sorry. And it's too interesting when you look at the history of Chaos as an army book for Warhammer Fantasy. Initially, things were all put into one book. Legions of Chaos was, I think, one of the first editions for the names of Chaos. Warriors of Chaos was another name for it. But then around, I think it's 6th edition, the 6th edition book for Chaos is called Hordes of Chaos. And it includes all the mortal units, all the demon units, and then it has supplemental information for how to put the beasts of Chaos into the army. And this carried on into 7th edition. And then in 8th edition, things kind of became very siloed. You have the Warriors of Chaos, Beastmen, and then the Demons of Chaos. And things kind of fall into that scope for the way that we look at factions. And it's definitely envisioned this way in Total War Warhammer, right? We've got the Demons of Chaos with like mortal units here and there. We've got the Warriors of Chaos, we've got Norska, and we've got Beastmen, right? We have all these things siloed out, but obviously there's an underlying thread of the ruinous powers underneath all 4 factions in the game itself. Now, what I think would be pretty cool and pretty important for an Azazel character in Total War Warhammer would be to bridge that gap, to finally give us a chance to have, hey, this is a Warriors of Chaos faction led by a Demon of Chaos, which brings demon units into the fore, or brings demon units into the faction, as well as mixing in some, if not all, of the mortal units in some specifically Slaaneshi, in Azazel's case, way, or specifically Khorne way for Valkia, which we kind of already have, or specifically Nurgle way for like a Festus, or Tzeentch for like a village or an Urgram, something like that. So I definitely want to see almost like a custom built out, let's not get crazy here, custom's kind of a wild term when it comes to CA, but I mean at least a mixing of these two factions to make a faction that is led by a Demon Prince that does pull from both. Because like I said, when you see about the lore here, you'll see that it is very much a character that leads Norskin and Warriors of Chaos. So let's jump now here into the lore for Heldenhammer, the book that goes really into the lore, of course, of Sigmar, but Azazel really kind of colors as the main antagonist of it all. So this all starts in the kind of time before the Empire solidifies, right? We have all these warring tribes throughout what is now the Empire, what is now the Old World. And probably the most important one, or the one that people know the most, is the Unbarisians, the ones that Sigmar Heldenhammer hails from. And within that is a human, not demon yet, named Garion. Now, remember, like I said, Garion was the name of Azazel's tribe in the old lore. It's actually his true name in the lore in Heldenhammer. And Garion has two siblings, a twin brother named Trinovantes, and then his sister Ravenna. And basically what happens is Sigmar, and this is before Sigmar is actually the king. And this is before Reichland's called Reichdorf, I believe, at that time. But basically, Sigmar says to Garion and to Trinovantes, you guys need to hold this line. You need to hold this location because we have orcs coming. And they cannot get past this point, more or less. And wouldn't you know it, orcs do come. And orcs do kind of get past the point. And they end up, for the most part, killing a lot of people. One of those people is Trinovantes, Garion's twin brother. And Garion doesn't blame the orcs for it. He blames Sigmar for his brother's death. And this is kind of where this is that genesis. This is that villain origin story for Azazel. So Garion swears vengeance upon Sigmar. And he goes to a sea. Okay, so I'm not really necessarily sure if it's a hag witch. The text kind of describes it as a hag witch. Hag woman is used very often, and she pretty much tells him a prophecy saying, hey, you need to kind of buy your time here. You don't need to go take vengeance upon Sigmar right away. You need to cloak your vengeance in the form of friendship. And that's what Garion does, because Sigmar is set to marry Ravenna, Garion's sister. So Sigmar and Ravenna are getting ready to get hitched, and Garion goes to kind of bury the hatchet with him. And Sigmar already knows that Garion's pissed off at him. They have some altercations beforehand. He knows that Garion is just not happy. And they do kind of bury that hatchet. And Sigmar he takes it very amiably. He's not a dick about it. He pretty much just says like, hey, you're Unbarisian. You're already part of the family, basically. Don't worry about it. This was never a problem. I understand. I would be kind of beside myself as well. It's essentially the stance that Sigmar takes. And this creates years-long friendship between the two, between Garion and Sigmar. And eventually something happens here. And we have a little excerpt I want to read for you guys about how Garion kind of comes around to his vengeance. He understands that over time, that it just kind of blunts that sharpness that vengeance has. And so here we go. Time and time again, Garion had ridden into battle alongside them. And each time, Sigmar was thankful for the strength of character that had driven the warrior to seek forgiveness. Ravenna had been overjoyed, and Sigmar had spent many pleasant times with her and Garion, hunting, riding the forest trails, or simply talking long into the night of his dream of uniting the tribes of man. Now with the darkness all around them and his sword brothers riding away from his circle to the crater, Sigmar was grateful for Garion's presence. He counted 100 heartbeats before urging his stallion forward, the 20 warriors who remained with him following swiftly behind. But you kind of see this character who at one point hates Sigmar, hates Pendrag, who we'll talk about in a bit here. It's basically the best friend of Sigmar, I believe his cousin too. And you get this character who kind of, is coming around to this. Like, you know what, maybe this isn't such a bad thing. But then Garion sees the prophecy that the Hag Witch told him about. And the prophecy was, when you see the sign of the red hand in the same breath as a wounded sword, that is the time for your vengeance. Seek out the water hemlock that grows in the marshes when no king rules in Reichdorf. And basically there's like an event where Sigmar's training and there's blood and something like that. It's kind of a reach. But basically Garion takes this as this is the moment. I kind of like almost like a trigger word from the KGB ignites him, and he decides, okay, I'm going to go through with this. All this hate that's been in my heart last, I think something like 8 years, something like that. It's time to do 6 long years. So for 6 long years, he held his hate close to his heart, nurturing it with each passing day and picking at the scab of it whenever it threatened to diminish. So he kind of comes around to this and decides to kill Sigmar. And in doing so, he poisons Sigmar and Ravenna, his sister, and stabs Ravenna and almost kills Sigmar. And eventually kind of flees north into what becomes Norska. See, at this time, Norska wasn't called Norska. It was more like campaigning into the north. And the Norskins weren't called the Norskins. They were called the Norsi. So that's where Garion stops becoming Garion and starts to become Azazel. He even gets this name given to him by one of the Norsi. It's kind of an interesting character, interesting Genesis story for this character, because we get a little bit behind the story of this demon prince, kind of very similar to Yuri in Total War Warhammer 3. We get a lot more about his presence. And this, if you think about this story, this could make for a really cool singular cinematic campaign in the same kind of fashion that they did Yuri for the prologue. And I hope that they kind of stick to this heavy narrative going into Warhammer 3 and some of its DLCs. But eventually, as you would imagine, Azazel is now Garion's name. He does return to the Empire at the head of the Norsi and attacks. He goes all over the place and does tons of destruction. But the big thing he does is goes and attacks Middenheim. And Middenheim is ruled over by a Count Pendrag. Now remember how I said that there is portions of the old lore that kind of eke into this? Well, Arthar, the Khorne champion from the 5th or 6th edition Citadel Journal, I guess his character's kind of been morphed now into Pendrag. And if you are familiar with Arthurian legend, King Arthur's full name is Arthur Pendragon, son of Uther Pendragon. So Pendrag, I guess, is how they kind of correlate that down into this character. And it's a pretty interesting point in the book because it's a 3-on-1 duel between Azazel and Pendrag. And then 2 other characters come and join in basically on the fray. And it's a pretty interesting, and it's a pretty good, pretty well-written little duel, I must say myself. And it's a fun little kind of, again, Genesis here, where you get that ultimate tipping point where Azazel truly becomes Azazel and not just simply a guy who's raging against the Empire. And it's Berserker King Otwin and another Count Marius, who attack Garion or Azazel. And Azazel basically takes a broken sword and punches it into the side of Pendrag's armor and ruptures his heart. And we get a bit of remorse here, right? That kind of this sad notion that, he just killed someone that he's known for so long as a bitter portion of his vengeance, even killing his own sister. And that's essentially that final tipping point that kind of poisons his character 100%. This is when he gets his arms and legs cut off because Obi-Wan has the high ground, more or less. But Azazel flees back up north into Norska, and in his sorrow, he meets a boy. And this boy's name is Morcar. Morcar is the name of the very first ever chosen. So it's a really kind of interesting story here, right? And we get this interesting story where Azazel has a lot of humanity attached to his character, and he does feel remorse. He does kind of jump away from the situations that create all of his downfall. And it's very interesting. And Sigmar, of course, chases after him and eventually beats the shit out of him and banishes him, more or less. Not banishes him, he like throws him into a dark pit and covers it with rocks, and that's when Azazel becomes a full-fledged Demon Prince of Slaanesh. And in this kind of time, you know, there's the constant back and forth of Azazel's coming back and forth into Sigmar's life. And eventually we know Sigmar dies and kind of falls into, not mythology, but well, I guess mythology might be a proper term there, but he ascends to divinity in the Empire. And in the end times, there is a duel between the revived Sigmar in the body of Emperor Karl Franz and Azazel. So here's an excerpt from that. It'll be cheesy, but it'll be cheesy in the way that Warhammer always is. So here you go. Here's the actual excerpt from the end times and the duel between these two. The Emperor awoke in darkness, his face sticky with blood, his body a mass of aches and pains. Forgot what that was like, he thought sourly as he pushed himself to his feet. The air was heavy and a slaughterhouse stink was thick in his nostrils. He looked around warily, hands flexing. He'd lost his rune fang somewhere between here and Kabbanda's hammer, and he scanned his surroundings for something to take its place. He peered into the darkness, marking the body of a chaos warrior nearby. The man's sword was to hand. Though he was loath to touch it, beggars couldn't be choosers. As he started forward, he took note of the corpses hanging from the ceiling on heavy chains and hooks. With a start, he realized he was under the great dome of the temple. For a brief heartbeat, rage pulsed through him to see the most holy of shrines defiled so, but he regained control of himself quickly. Work first, mourn later, he muttered.
Same old Sigmar.
The voice slithered out of the dark. The Emperor froze and then turned, following the echoes of laughter. He saw a throne of skulls and flayed skin rising above a dais of bones, and at its base, a familiar gleam of bronze. Ha, he murmured. No cleansing flame, no sunlight morning had ever seemed as beautiful as the sight of his hammer gleaming in the dark. He stepped towards it, hand reaching out, but stopped as the laughter echoed again.
Yes, it is you. I knew from the first. I smelt your stink on the wind the moment that fool elf freed you from the vortex. Unversion. For 2,000 years, this world was free of you, but here you are, hiding in a dead man's skin.
Sigmar looked up as the alabaster-skinned figure climbed atop the back of the throne and spread great black wings. Eyes like polished opals shone as the horned head twisted about.
It has been a long time, my friend,
the Demon Prince murmured.
Centuries since we last spoke, eh, Sigmar?
Garen, Sigmar said. He felt the old hate welling up again, like a wound that had never properly healed. A woman's face passed before his eyes and receded into memory. This thing before him had been his friend, once upon a time. Now it was a plaything of chaos.
Azazel,
the Demon Prince corrected gently.
Alas, no time to catch up, I'm afraid. No time to speak of better days, of loves lost and won. Time is speeding up and the world judders to pieces in haste. I thought, well, one last moment before the end.
Azazel pointed at the fallen shape of Gal Maraz, where it lay amidst the refuse of barbarity.
You want that filthy thing, cousin? Then come and take it if you dare.
Sigmar lunged for the hammer. Azazel gave a wild shriek of laughter and flung himself towards his prey, drawing a blade covered in ruinous sigils as he did so. The blade slammed down, inches from Sigmar's head. The Emperor rolled aside. Azazel rose, wings stretching out. He stood between Sigmar and his weapon, and spread his arms as if in invitation.
A good effort, but not good enough. Not for this,
Azazel said. He took a step forward towards Sigmar.
I wish that we had more time, my friend. I've been waiting so long to see you again.
Can't say the same, I'm afraid, Sigmar said. Azazel laughed.
"Oh, how I've missed you," he said.
Then, with a single snap of his wings, he hurled forward. His blade hissed as it whipped towards Sigmar's neck. Sigmar twisted aside and flung himself towards his hammer. Even as he caught the haft, he heard the boom of Azazel's wings. He rolled onto his back and just managed to block the Demon Prince's blade with the haft of Galmaraz. For a moment, Azazel crouched above him. The blade writhed like a thing alive in his clawed grip.
"Do you ever think of her, brother of my heart?"
Azazel purred as he forced the blade down.
"Do you ever recall her scent in lonely moments, or the way the light caught her hair? And her memories pressed down on your heart when you recall Ravenna? Do you spare even a thought for dear Pendrag?"
Azazel chuckled.
"I know I don't."
I think about them always, Garen, as I have thought about this moment, Sigmar said. From between gritted teeth, he felt stronger than before, as if some part of him, which had been missing up until now, had returned. It wasn't simply that the presence of Galmaraz, but something else, as if a weight had been lifted from him. He heard the clash of steel in his head and the song of distant stars. He pushed back against Azazel. The Demon Prince's eyes widened.
"What are you?"
Sigmar shoved the haft of his hammer up, and Azazel screeched as the edge of his own blade gashed his chest and throat. He tumbled backwards, wings flailing. His blood hissed as it burned the flagstones. Sigmar swept his hammer out. An inhuman bone splattered as the force of the blow tore the Demon Prince's sword from his grip. The sword wailed like a wounded cat as it was sent skidding across the floor. Sigmar kicked him in the head as he tried to rise. The Demon Prince yowled as the Emperor trod on his wings, pinning him in place. Sigmar raised Galmaraz over his head. "You said it yourself, Garen. There is no time, and so I send you back to the Forge of Souls more quickly than you deserve."
"No!"
Azazel shrieked. His eyes bulged in fear as he tried to tear himself free to no avail. The hammer came down with thunderous finality. The great wings twitched once and then fell still. Sigmar Unbarajan looked down at the rapidly dissolving ruin of a man he'd once called friend, shook himself, and strode away, towards the sound of fighting. There was a war to be won, and a world to be saved. There you go. There's our character, Azazel, and as I've kind of said it in my Discord, Sigmar just sounds like me talking in a deeper tone, and Azazel sounds like if I wanted to do a bad impersonation of Frieza from Dragon Ball Z. But we've had some fun with it. So let's now talk about the rules here for Azazel, because he does have some, well, rules. And as you would expect, he would be a glass cannon style character, I think very similar to Nakari, right? With Nakari, you got a character who can just pour out a ton of damage, but he really can't take a ton. And when we look at the profile for Azazel, he has 8 weapon skill, which is extremely high. He has 5 strength and 5 toughness, which is good, but not amazingly high for a Demon Prince. 4 wounds, 9 initiative, so very quick, and 5 attacks and 9 leadership. It's the typical kind of action. He has a Demon Blade for his weapon. But let's take a look at his special rules. That's where all the fun stuff jumps out, because he's got Demonic Gifts, Aura of Slaanesh, and Soporific Musk. So I think he would default have Soporific Musk as a damage type here. Maybe even having the typical kind of entrapments of Slaanesh, so AP, maybe even a poison, but I definitely think the devastating flanker attribute attached to him. He can definitely fly because he has wings. The Mark of Slaanesh he would have. He would be a sorcerer, so he would know the lore of Slaanesh. I would kind of like to see him having a custom kit of lore. I find that tends to be a little bit more fun than just outright having another Lore of Slaanesh legendary lord. Because Nakari's got the Lore of Slaanesh, so why not make Azazel dip into both? Slaanesh is Shadow and Slaanesh, I think, for that race. So having that kind of custom kit might be a little fun. And that might be a different way to kind of differentiate between the two as far as just magical capabilities. But then he has a ability here called Temptator. Those who come face to face with the awesome presence of Azazel risk gambling with their very souls. Many who see him lose their free will and become incapable of opposing him. They are used as playthings by Azazel until he grows bored of them and disposes of them as he sees fit. At the beginning of the close combat phase, select one model to base contact with Azazel. That selected model must make a leadership test. Basically, it's going to take control of the model. So we kind of have this mechanic already present in the game with the seduction mechanic. And we know that N'Kari does get a bonus to seduction, but I think that would be Azazel's kind of primary focus when it comes to campaign and early battle effects, is he would be able to maybe get a, maybe get a seduction for free, a vast discount on them, an increase to the cap, kind of the same set that we get already with N'Kari, but maybe blown up even further. And maybe some innate relationship bonuses with Norska, something of the sort, kind of hinting into his relationship with Norska from the past. And he also has for his magic item, the Demon Blade. Azazel wields a mighty enchanted blade, a deadly living weapon against which mortal armor is no proof. No armor saving throws are allowed against attacks made with the Demon Blade. And I think that this is just a standard profile anti-infantry high AP weapon, probably an activatable too. That could probably even trigger that further. What I would really like to see though is some other bound ability on Azazel that has to do with controlling units. And that has typically been embodied as a rampage mechanic, which is good and fine and all, but I think it could be more fun to either have a bound army ability or something like that can take control of something, or at least force something to attack its own units, and not a direct control. Like Rampage, you just can't control it. But it would be interesting if you had a Rampage mechanic that, rather than just simply not being able to control something, that unit automatically attacked the closest allied unit to it. So let's say, it's Azazel squaring off between 2 units of spearmen. Who cares what faction? There's just 2 units of spearmen. Well, he uses his ability on one of the units of spearmen, and it forces it to attack its closest friendly unit, which would be the other unit of spearmen, and Azazel can now pull out of the situation while they kind of kill each other or rip at each other. And I think that is something that I would really like to see, rather than just simply another forced rampage mechanic, which, it's played its hand a lot so far, but I would like to see this a little bit differently. Now, when we look at the 5th edition stuff here, he does have Master of Sorcery, which would make him a little bit better at his Slaanesh spells. So maybe that would be the big differentiator here too, would be that giving him the Lore of Slaanesh and an ability to have spell mastery, much like Kairos does for Lore of Tzeentch, could be a way that could play into things here too. He also has like great claw and a striking tail, things that were more prevalent in 5th edition that you could kind of play into his character as like, hey, this great claw gives him an increased AP damage on his special skill line. Now, as far as actual naming of his faction goes, I went with what a lot of people know him as, the Captain of the Ecstatic Legion, because there was an actual article here that calls him the Captain of the Ecstatic Legion. Could be the name for the faction that Azazel leads. And where he could possibly be is in a location perhaps close to the demons of chaos, Yuri, Daniel, as he is belovedly known, in the, I think it's the Trollheim Mountains, just to the east. So that would kind of put him pretty close to N'Kari. You could have him starting somewhere in the actual lands of the Empire, or just in that region, to kind of give a presence of a legendary lord to stop Scrag and give the Order Tide a different target other than Daniel, right? Other than Yuri, the Demon Prince. And I think that that's going to be an important thing here. If we got some sort of Warriors of Chaos DLC, is a way to kind of change the power dynamic in the old world, in Norska old world and Northern Chaos Waste, because it becomes too one-sided. We know that if you're playing the Demon Prince, you're going to get dealt with an Order Tide of a unified Kislev against you. We know you're going to see Scrag just get stupid out of control, and if you're playing as Kislev, it's going to be the reverse. You're going to deal with Scrag, or you're going to deal with the Demon Tide. And I think that giving the Demon Prince a little bit of insulation against the Order Tide, which I would argue, and you guys can tell me if you think otherwise in the comments, is a bigger problem, because Scrag is obviously going to get big too. And if you put something like a character like Azazel somewhere in a direction, and I've said the same thing here with Village, somewhere in a direction that can give Scrag a bit of a speed bump, I think it's important to kind of help bring him down in his rampage capabilities, just rip apart the old world. But that kind of covers our speculation here on Azazel. I went pretty deep on some of the lore that is not standard Army Book Edition lore, which we usually do. Usually we just kind of jump to the Army editions, or Army books. But like I said, there's not a whole ton of information for Azazel in any of the current edition of books. Last one was in that 5th with a little Citadel journal in the 6th. So go ahead and let me know what you guys think about this. Do you think it would actually be a different Slaanesh character brought into a possible Warriors of Chaos Slaanesh themed DLC? Go ahead and let me know in the comment section below. You can even let me know if you thought that cheesy rendition of the end times was worth it for you. I don't do that too often, but I like to have a little fun here and there. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one and take care.